In the last few segments, we've been talking about development and change. And if you recall, I argued strongly that we should dump the word development because it's a value-ridden term, and instead focus on change because it is value neutral. Now, I want to pick up on this, and if you recall, I also mentioned that there are universal patterns to change, despite all the diversity in the specific patterns of change that one sees. But there are some universal patterns, and I want to begin with that discussion. But before doing so, I want to talk a little bit about change itself to give you some idea what would be the best way to understand it. Perhaps the best way to understand change is to look at the 20th century. To paraphrase the great historian Eric Hobsbawm regarding the 20th century, there have been unprecedented technological and scientific progress. Today, well, actually last century, today we're in the 21st century. In the 20th century, more people than any other time in the past got richer, lived longer, and lived better lives than any era before that. On the negative side, more people got killed in wars than any other time in human history. The two most devastating all-out wars, the World War I and World War II, also occurred in this century. And also more people got tortured in the 20th century than any other century in human history. Now, if you put these positives and negatives aside and ask yourself a basic question, in a century or two from now, what will we remember, what will we recall about the 20th century? Chances are that it won't be any of these things that I mentioned any more than we remember, for example, the Crusade nowadays. And so let me give you a proposition about the 20th century. Most likely what is going to be recalled about the 20th century was that it marked a time of extraordinary, accelerated change in human life, especially political change, and particularly in the last half of the 20th century. That is during the period that we typically call the Cold War period. So during the 20th centuries, more states moved from what I would call pre-mass politics, which has been a topic we've discussed in the past, to mass politics than any other period in the history of humanity. So I want to begin with that notion and look at the Middle East. And you will see that the Middle East societies have experienced extremely rapid pace of change during the past 60 years. And change has occurred in all these countries and have gone in several directions. So the change has not been unilinear. Such change, although it is specific in its form and varies from region to region and from country to country, so it goes all over the place. Nonetheless, I hope I can convince you that there are, in terms of overall patterns of the change, there are universal patterns. So that's what I want to begin my main topic with today. There are four universal patterns of change. Europe and the United States went through this in the earlier era, and most of the Middle East really went through this in the second half of the 20th century. And these changes that I'm talking about, these four changes, are political changes, even though they have ramifications for other disciplines. But the changes really are from pre-mass politics to mass politics. So what are these four changes? The first one is value change. This is terrifically important. It really does affect the political behavior of a nation. Equally important is what I will call identity change. That one is also very important because it is a critical factor in whether or not you're going to be a nationalistic entity or not. The third change is elite change, and elite change probably is what started the whole change process. That is, all four changes that I'm going to be talking about was instantiated by the changes in the elite. And of course, the final change that we're going to be talking about is captured with the rubric of centralization of governmental power and governmental control over the society. In other words, the last change really betokens the rise of a modern state system with its control apparatus. And again, the proposition is that these are universal patterns. Europe, United States, went through these changes a century and a half earlier, and the Middle East and African nations and other developing countries went through it at a later point. So what I'll be doing is discussing each of these changes in some detail, and hopefully that would clarify to you why this epic transition from pre-mass politics to mass politics was defining in its role the political changes in the Middle East. So we want to begin now with the first item here, and that is the value change. And the value change, let me state that it's what is called by some sociologists a change from ascriptive value to achievement value. The locutions are those of Marion Levy, a first-class social scientist, and he had a major insight into the key elements of change, and I have borrowed these terms from him. Also, another very good and accomplished scholar who studied development process, his name was Daniel Lerner. Back in the 1950s, he wrote a classic book called The Passing of the Traditional Society, which tried to capture the value change that I'm talking to you today. So ascriptive, let's look at that and see what it means. It means essentially accepting the situation a person is born into and trying to be satisfied only achieving within it. So if you're born to a farmer, that's what you want to be. If your father happens to be a tailor, that's what you're going to be. In other words, it won't occur to you to be something else other than what you were born into. So the ascriptive value are those values that are really not for progress. It makes the society very static, very little change. Now, by contrast, once the value of society changes from what Levy described as ascriptive to one of achievement, then you have a very different situation. And that is captured by rejecting the limits that one sees on their ability to achieve. Probably the best example of this that I can give, that is the transition from ascriptive to one of achievement, is one of Daniel Lerner's own story. Back in the 1950s, he asked a Turkish peasant, "Would you like to be the president of Turkey?" The answer was, "Sir, this is blasphemous." So when you go back to that period, you will see that in the ascriptive, you can't even think of that possibility. Today, all kinds of peasants want to be presidents of Turkey. So you can see that things have dramatically changed. And achievement is when son of a tailor, instead of trying to be a tailor like his father, wants to be an engineer, wants to be a businessman, and is willing to break the mold of tradition and move ahead. So, achieving beyond one's socioeconomic boundaries is really at the heart of this change in value. And what you're seeing is that beginning in the 1950s, ascription as a value sharply began to decline throughout the Middle East, some places a little faster than other places, and achievement as a value began to rise. And the more this happened, the narrower came the technological gap separating the West from the East. And the process now is really complete in the Middle East. And remember, all along I've been telling you that this is a universal pattern. You want to know what was the equivalent situation in Europe? The Gilded Europe. The guilds in Europe were very much the counterpart of what I've been telling you about. So, the question now is, what are the political implications of the kind of value change that I have mentioned to you? Put in a nutshell, the answer is revolution of rising expectations. I can talk about it, but probably I can illustrate it by one quote without taking a lot of time explaining it, and you'll see this. So let me go directly now to a quote. So it says, the authorities think just because we are poor, we do not share the demands of the rich people. Well, they're wrong. We too want our children to do sports and to learn English, mathematics, and drawings, but the mosque in our neighborhood only offers religious training, which is too traditional and outdated for our children. They should learn modern science and art to become somebody. It is not only by reciting Quran that they will attain this goal. The quote is from an Iranian rural woman back in 1998, Azadeh Kian. That's for you a value change from ascription to achievement. So as you can see, this is very, very profound change in the way you see. And the revolution of rising expectation, think of yourself, think of the point, expectation from whom? Well, the expectation is from the government. If there are no schools, if you don't have jobs, if you are running your country down with debt, if you are allying with countries that most of the population views as enemy, all of these are kind of expectation that allows masses to hold the government accountable. And even if you have a dictatorship, you may end up facing a revolt on your hand. So this is a very, very important change. The next element of this is the other consequence of this important change that I mentioned, and that is political participation. When the value changes from one of ascription to achievement, and when there is this revolution of expectation, then people are inclined to participate in politics. So in the period that society was dominated by ascriptive values, almost all the people in the society accepted the leadership. A lot of them viewed the king as having divine rights. Now, with the change in that value from ascription to achievement, it occurs to almost everyone to challenge the leadership if the leadership isn't performing. So essentially what's happening is that you're going from minimal political participation to mass politics. And today when you look at the Middle East, Palestinians are entirely participant. The traditional leaders with whom Israel was trying to work things out no longer can control the masses. So where do you look for evidence of mass political participation, especially if the society is not a democratic one? Well, there are some good indicators. You look at the literacy rate, you look at the number of people that have university education, the percentage of population that are have university education. You look at the size of the urban population. That's a very, very important point. Most of the uprising occurs in the urban area. And so these are pretty good diagnostic tools to figure out. But also you can look at the opinion-making elites. That is, those elites that are much more influential in shaping public opinions, such as journalists, such as academics. And here you look to see if their views are different than that of the government. Because if it is, it means that these people believe part of the public are receptive to alternative views and challenges. So, to summarize this portion, value change in the Middle East has had a tremendous impact in that in a very, very brief period, a lot of these people have become political participants. And when I say brief period, I'm really talking about a span of a generation, 25 years, 30 years. And because of the pace having accelerated so fast, there are some peculiar manifestation of these type of political participation that are not always observable when you go back in history in Europe. But that's because there are differences in era after all, even though the overall pattern is a universal one.